stream. So Americans are out hitting the polls today, voting on their future. One thing that's not on the ballot today is the $36 trillion elephant in the room, talking about the U.S. national debt. This is a crisis that, regardless of the outcome of today's election, is very likely to peak under the term of the next U.S. president. This is an event which likely have very dire consequences for the U.S. dollar and also have a big impact on gold and silver. So that's what we're going to talk about in today's live stream. Now, a bit of a warning, I'm a little under the weather. I have caught a bug. So if I'm a little raspy or I'm gargling on my own secretions a little more than normal, I apologize. If that's something that you don't like, this might not be the live stream for you. And if you're still around after that warning, let's delve into this crisis. So it's a bit ironic, I think, or maybe just appropriate, I guess, that the U.S. national debt is about to cross $36 trillion on election day, right? The irony, pretty interesting. It looks like this might very well hit $36 trillion by tomorrow. By the time we know who the next U.S. president is going to be, hopefully we know in the next 24 hours or so. But this is a crisis. Really, I think it's important to remember during election season, this is a bipartisan crisis. This is a crisis that both parties are responsible for over the past several decades, regardless of who has been in office, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. The trend for the U.S. national debt, it's been steadily higher, steadily and relentlessly higher. Sofa King says the bankers win. Yeah, that's right. When debt increases exponentially, who wins? Well, it's the central bankers, the political elites. It's not you and me, though. Although it could end up being gold and silver. I mean, they could be winners after a fashion from this debt crisis. You want to buy some gold and silver, make sure you check out today's live stream sponsor, SD Bullion. You can go to sdbullion.com/new, where new customers can get gold or silver at spot on their first order. So make sure you check them out if you're in the market for some bullion. Now, let's talk about the U.S. national debt and why this really is approaching crisis levels. I mean, it's been moving up considerably for decades now. Also, it's important to keep in mind that the past three presidents, Joe Biden included, have increased the national debt more than all presidents preceding them. Let that sink in. This is an exponential crisis which we are on the verge of, and it's not one that is likely going to be resolved anytime soon. Now, we can talk briefly about the different candidates and how this might play out, I guess. I mean, if Harris wins, let's just say the debt is going to explode even faster. Now, if Trump wins, he's paid a little bit of lip service to the fact that the debt crisis exists. I guess at least that's a positive. I've heard, yeah, Orange Man's slightly better. Matthew Crustlife says he's going to appoint, I guess, Elon Musk and Ron Paul, of all people. I mean, that's great. I love Ron Paul. To go in there and look for ways to save money and reduce inefficiency. But, I mean, that's kind of a hallmark of government, right? Inefficiency. It's more of a feature rather than a bug. So forgive me if I'm not real optimistic about the ability of Elon Musk and Donald Trump and Ron Paul to resolve this crisis, especially when you consider that any attempt to reform spending very likely to be stalled in Congress and to just, reach some kind of a impasse in Congress is basically completely politically unviable for any reforms to take place. I mean, everybody's got their pet projects. War, of course, is a huge contributor to this. So we have to consider the fact that we are potentially on the verge of a major global conflict. It looks like in the Middle East now, Iran is potentially preparing for more strikes on Israel. So, if that plays out, it doesn't matter who's going to be in the Oval Office, we're going to be heading for more conflict. That's my forecast, at least. And that means that there is simply going... Okay, I don't think that's true. Who put the super chat in there? I'm not going to read that out loud, but interesting. Thanks for the super chat, though. Just look at the government's own projections for what is going to occur with the debt. Okay, this is from the Congressional Budget Office's forecast. And this is where we're at. Well, this is from 2023. This is where we were at then in terms of debt to GDP. You can see that to find a time when the debt to GDP ratio was as high as it is today, you've got to go all the way back to the end of World War II, the Second World War. Now, ostensibly, we're not at war right now. If you listen to Harris, right, there's no U.S. troops involved anywhere around the world. Now, I mean, obviously that's BS, but we're not at the end of, the biggest conflict in human history, and yet we still have these onerous debt levels. Now, according to the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, this is set to increase quite a bit. They're talking about hitting, 150% of GDP by 2053? Now, one thing, if you look at government projections for spending and for debt, if you go back historically, they're almost always understating how things will actually play out. If you look at the projections from about a decade ago, they are that we would have about $25 trillion in debt today. Now, where are we actually? 36 trillion. So, if this is what the CBO is telling us, how is this going to actually play out? But honestly, I don't think there's any chance that this plays out the way that they've forecast. I think that this is a crisis that is going to reach a peak well before 2053. I mean, I think that this is going to play out during the term of the next U.S. president, whoever that happens to be. Now, how does that really play out? Well, let's talk about it. But first, got 147 people in the live stream. Hello, welcome to the Election Day live stream. Do me a favor, smash the like button, subscribe to the channel yet if you think this is information worth sharing. If you enjoy these videos, we got about 19 likes right now. I think we can do better than that. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. Now, if you don't like the video, well, I guess don't hit the like button. But let's talk about why this is going to reach a crisis. A lot of it has to do with the exponential nature of the debt and also the rising interest cost of this debt. The interest cost on the national debt now exceeds $1.1 trillion. So that makes it the third largest item on the federal budget, right behind Social Security and Medicare. It actually has exceeded the defense budget, although I suppose that if World War III really does start or really breaks out in earnest, maybe the defense budget might exceed that level briefly, but the interest cost is set to skyrocket. Now, an interesting feature of interest rates is that, the Fed, they started to cut back in September. They cut the federal funds rate, and thank you for everybody who liked the video. Although some of you haven't done it yet, please smash that like button. The Fed began to cut back in September, but something that's been occurring, despite the fact that the Fed cut the federal funds rate, since that time, the interest rate on long-term U.S. Treasuries has been rising. I'm going to try and pull up the chart for the 30-year yield here, but the 30-year yield has been rising steadily since middle of September, despite the fact that the Fed has been cutting the federal funds rate. Now, see, I think I've got a chart here that I can show you if my tablet here will comply. Okay, it doesn't matter. No chart available. Sorry, can't show you a chart. You just got to take my word for it, or you can look up a chart of the 30-year yield, the 10-year yield, any of these long-term U.S. debt instruments. The interest rate has been rising. Now, why is that happening? Well, it's happening because the debt market is saturated, right? And also, inflation expectations are on the rise. So investors are demanding a higher yield, and also because the government has simply been borrowing so much money are selling so much debt that it is driving interest rates higher. The more debt you sell, the more you got to sweeten the pot for investors. So the interest cost is going to continue to rise quite a bit. In fact, it's not just that the new debt is being taken out at these levels, it's all the old debt which is reaching maturity. Now, a lot of that debt was taken on when rates were lower. So as this debt rolls over and has to be renewed at the higher rate, you're going to see the interest costs continue to rise. Now, that's a real problem. As I mentioned, it's now the third biggest expense for the federal government, and the debt is rising rapidly. Now, when does this really become a crisis? Well, I mean, I think we've already crossed that Rubicon. I don't think that there's any coming back from this, but it reaches a point when it can no longer be ignored when the interest cost on the national debt begins to exceed the revenue, right? The tax revenue. And that is where we are headed, unfortunately, unless the borrowing stops. But, one thing that both parties seem to agree on here is that we need to continue borrowing huge sums of money. No one wants to cut spending. And even if you got a president in there, again, who was interested in, slashing government spending, balancing the budget, there's no way they could do it because it'll just reach gridlock in Congress. Now, probably the worst thing that could happen would be if you actually got a president in office and his party or her party also controlled both houses of Congress, because you might think, oh, they'll take advantage of that to reform spending. No, they will use that to steamroll through legislation to pass more spending, because in this system, sadly, it has really just become all about who can buy the most votes. That is what the elections are. You have a population who is heavily propagandized and who don't understand why the currency is being debased the way it is, right? People don't understand that the reason the US dollar, this used to be a dollar, right? A silver dollar. The reason that one of these now is going to cost you $30 is because the currency has been debased through all of the currency creation, through the steady debasement of the US dollar. And eventually, the reason that the debt is so important for gold and silver and for the dollar is when that day comes, when the interest cost begins to exceed the revenue, and maybe this will happen before that time comes. Maybe the political elites and the central bankers are going to try to get out ahead of this. The only way to really bring down the interest rates, absent balancing the budget and making the federal government more creditworthy, is going to be direct debt monetization by the Federal Reserve, by the central bank. When they come in and they buy up debt, it drives down interest rates. And that means that this chart is going to be one to keep an eye on. This is the Fed's balance sheet. So let's look at previous instances of debt monetization. You've got the 2008 financial crisis, bought up, quite a bit of U.S. debt. Then you had like QE infinity. Now, the Fed tried to normalize things here in 2018, 2019. You can see the very slight dip in the level of the Fed balance sheet. But then what happened here? Well, the overnight lending facility at the Fed broke actually in 2019, pre-pandemic. They had to return to buying up debt. Then, of course, the pandemic came along. Boom, $4 trillion of direct debt monetization, Banana Republic style, followed by just a massive increase in the Fed balance sheet up until mid-2022, stopped just shy of $9 trillion. And then, look at what they did then. They've been trying to normalize their balance sheet since then. We're down to around $7 trillion. That little spike is the banking crisis in March of last year, when they went ahead and began debt monetization again briefly to bail out the banking system. They successfully did that. But the reason I show you that chart is the Fed is very likely going to have to return to QE as a result of the looming debt crisis. But what that is going to mean for gold and silver is going to be dramatic. I mean, think about this. The price of silver is up about 40% over the course of the past year. That's against the backdrop of higher interest rates and nominally a Fed normalization of its balance sheet through quantitative tightening. See, the Fed in 2022, because inflation began to soar to almost double digits, even according to the official numbers, was forced to begin buying back, or selling off rather, or letting mature the debt on their balance sheet, trying to bring this down, shrink the money supply, fight inflation. I mean, that's what they tell us. But keep in mind, this number has been going down, and gold and silver have been absolutely blowing up, right? Gold hitting record all-time highs, silver up almost 40% year over year, more than 40%. Got to look at the chart to see what the exact number is. But just imagine what's going to happen to the precious metals if that's what they've been doing against a backdrop of quantitative tightening and elevated interest rates. As the Fed continues to ease and is forced to ease at an escalated pace due to this looming debt crisis, the price of gold and silver are going to absolutely explode. There's no doubt in my mind. Now, yeah, I see people talking about Peanut the squirrel in the chat there. Yeah, R.I.P. Peanut. Loving hand of government protecting its citizens from that terrifying squirrel. But that's an aside. Um, Look, the debt crisis is not going anywhere. Yeah, expect short squeezes very soon, James Abrams says. And that's certainly true. The fact that gold and silver have risen as fast as they have, it puts a lot of pressure on these U.S. banks um, who have these significant short positions against silver. But that is going to look like, just nothing compared to what's coming when the Fed returns to quantitative easing. And this is something you really don't hear anybody discussing, the return potentially to debt monetization by the Federal Reserve. And yet, that means I think that it's going to take markets that much more by surprise, and it'll have that much more of a profound impact on the metals markets when that event actually occurs. Hey, look, we got some gold backs here. If you're looking for an alternative gold backed currency to the US dollar, you might want to get your hands on some of those before the Fed returns to debt monetization and the metal soar. That's a gold backed currency that circulates in 5 states. And I think things like that, whether it be, gold backs or just regular old gold and silver bullion, they're going to become very much in favor when these events play out. Recently the World Gold Council released their gold demand report for Q3 2023, or rather 2024. And this quarter three of 2024, actually had record high demand for gold around the world for a third quarter. So the trend remains intact that investors are moving into the precious metals. But, the interesting thing is if you look at where the buying was coming from, it's still central banks. It's still, high net worth investors who were buying up gold, at least at this point. I mean, the report didn't say anything about silver, but I think silver is still kind of just waiting for its moment. Nobody's talking about silver. I mean, I know there was the Russian thing with Russia starting to buy silver for their state fund, but still, you see a lot more talk about gold than about silver. But, an interesting thing also that I saw in that report from the World Gold Council was that ETF inflows were up for the first quarter since 2022. So that's a sign, I think, that retail investors may be getting a little bit more interested in the precious metals. But you can tell that still there's not that much demand among retail investors for this stuff just yet. Because when you go to SD Bullion, you go to your local coin shop, you will see that premiums on these products remain fairly low and that most things are still in stock. But that could change at the drop of a hat. One thing about the retail silver and gold market, you talk about kind of niche products like goldbacks, for example. I mean, how many of these are really out there for people to buy up? But even just old things like, Morgan dollars and silver rounds and silver bars, this is such a small market that when investors catch wind of what is coming, and I mean, I think everybody's sort of distracted right now by the election. It's sort of like a bread and circuses thing. Everybody's got, the thrill that their candidate might win and everything's going to be fixed. But, look at the U.S. debt. Again, hitting $36 trillion here on Election Day. I think that the illusion of choice that we're being provided with, and I'm not saying that there's no difference between the candidates, but when it comes to, important things like the dollar as a currency and the status of the dollar as the world reserve currency and, this sort of thing, there's maybe not that much difference, or at least I'm not real confident in anybody's plans to protect those things. And again, this is evidenced by the fact that the debt is just absolutely skyrocketing. And, as I said, Donald Trump has paid some lip service to fixing that situation, but I'll believe it when I see it. And hopefully that will play out because despite the fact that gold and silver are going to rise from this debt crisis going out of control, I think it'll still be overall a fairly negative thing for the economy. I'm kind of rambling at this point, going far afield, but I'm just going to kind of give you my thoughts on a few more things with the election. One thing that I think may actually put a little bit of downward pressure on gold following this election is if Trump wins, One of the big drivers of gold thus far has been the dollar weaponization under the Biden presidency. And, Harris has sort of been part of that, I guess. I mean, I don't know how much she actually does over there at the White House, probably not too much. Um, but the dollar weaponization and sanctions have been a huge contributor to the rise in gold prices. And if Trump is elected, he has stated that he will not use sanctions the way that they have been used. So, I'm not saying gold's going to fall or anything. And ultimately, I think Trump will probably pursue easy money policies, low interest rates, debt monetization, all that, just as much as anybody else would. But the de-dollarization aspect may actually take a little bit of a breather if he wins the election here. So that could have some interesting impacts on the gold market. Maybe we'll get a little buying opportunity here. Not entirely sure about that, but it's just something that kind of crosses my mind. But the de-dollarization aspect and central banks buying gold has been the primary driver of putting gold up to record all-time highs thus far. However, as I mentioned, I think that is going to shift to retail investors at some point, and that's when having your hands on some physical metal is really going to be what you want to do. Okay, we've got 281 people in the live stream right now. Do me a favor, we need 13 likes to hit 100 thumbs up. I would really appreciate it if you smash the like button. I went out and voted today. Did anybody else go out and vote? Put a 1 in the chat if you went out and voted. I'm sure that some of the viewers here are disillusioned enough that you skipped the polls, but I did actually go out and vote. And, hope springs eternal, right? That there might be some kind of solution to these problems that we face. Ben Case says in the chat, Trump said on Rogan that sanctions are the best weapon to use. Well, I did watch that interview. I don't recall that specific moment. Maybe he will resort to sanctions. I know he's big into tariffs and kind of protectionist monetary policy and protectionist trade policy like that. I don't think that, global trade is going to return to what it was pre-2022. An interesting story, SD Blaine did a video on this on their YouTube channel recently, was India's repatriation of their gold from London. India this year, they've had 2 big repatriations. The most recent one was 102 tons of gold that they took back into their custody. It had been stored in vaults in London. Earlier this year in May, they did another 100-ton repatriation of gold. Now, that's a lot of gold. I mean, the logistics of that alone are pretty significant. But why are they doing that? Well, it's because despite the fact that India and the UK, I think they have a fine relationship, India understands, that if you don't hold it, you don't own it. Yeah, Ben Case says here, sorry, it was tariffs, he said. Yeah, right. So Trump doesn't want to use sanctions as much as tariffs. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. And that's why I think maybe that de-dollarization trade may be taking a break, given the fact, if he wins, that is, in that scenario. But there's plenty of other things like the $36 trillion U.S. national debt, for example, that will likely contribute to higher gold prices and silver prices moving forward. But again, back to the India story. So, yeah, they repatriated a large amount of gold. The reason being, I mean, look at Russia's foreign assets that were held abroad. They were frozen when the geopolitical relations with them soured. And so India is likely concerned about similar problems. So they're repatriating their gold. So, yeah, we pay tariffs. Rick Crute says, we pay the tariffs. That is true. I tend to fall into that same camp of thinking. I think that Trump's tariff policy will likely contribute to higher prices, especially for goods that we import. Now, I mean, it's a double-edged sword there, right? I mean, it does also contribute to the creation of jobs domestically. And I do think one good thing that we could get out of a Trump presidency, if he manages to pull it off, is that he has discussed replacing the income tax with tariffs. Now, that is something that harkens back to more than 100 years ago in U.S. history. I do think that would be good. If you could actually replace the income tax with tariffs, that would be great. But the problem is that in order to do that, I think it's unlikely you're going to be able to collect as much from tariffs as you can from a direct income tax. And I haven't heard Trump talk about cutting taxes commensurate with that reduction in income. And that means that if he does try and do something like that, it's very likely that this number is going to explode higher. I mean, there's no free lunch, unfortunately, right? So you either have a giant government and you promise everybody all of these things to buy votes, and you borrow huge sums of money to finance these programs, or you make the hard decisions and you cut the budget, or you drastically cut spending. But I see no sign that that is in the cards, regardless of the outcome of the election, and therefore the debt crisis is not going to be alleviated through any means other than debasement of the currency. The monetization of the debt. You could fix the debt crisis overnight. It would be very easy. All you have to do, have the Federal Reserve create or have the Treasury, say, issue a 100-year bond for $36 trillion, set the interest rate at zero, and have the Federal Reserve buy it, right? I mean, boom, bada bing, bada boom. This is a lot like the idea of them minting like $1 trillion platinum coin or whatever. I mean, that could eliminate the national debt overnight, but the problem is it would completely eviscerate the dollar, and also it would undermine the confidence of anybody who invests in U.S. debt, anybody who lends the federal government money, that they will ever be paid back in anything other than worthless paper. And so this is a problem, unfortunately, without a real clean solution at this point. We've already borrowed the $36 trillion, so we're going to have to pay the piper. And when we do, it's likely going to be a real problem for the US dollar, but it could be very positive for the price of gold and silver, especially in dollar terms. If someone asks you what you want for Christmas, tell them silver, please. Rick Karutz says that in the chat. Yeah, I think that every year we're approaching, I guess Halloween's done, right? So you got Thanksgiving and Christmas around the corner after the election. And yeah, silver is always a great thing to get for your loved ones. If you've got any, kids in your family or whatever, you can get them a 1 ounce silver round. Maybe give them a little lesson on sound money while you're at it. That's always a good thing to do. All right, so this live stream has gone on, I think, long enough on this election day. Thanks for watching, everybody. That's all I really had to cover today was the looming U.S. national debt crisis. And again, very ironic that as we all hit the polls today, we're about to cross a remarkable threshold in the U.S. national debt. It looks like we just crossed 35. Now we're going to hit 36. I mean, who knows what's going to happen by year end? Leave me a comment down below to let me know what you think about this looming crisis. Thanks for watching, everybody. Stay safe and happy stacking. I will catch you next time. Smart Silver Stacker, out.